Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to kind of a new series that we're going to do on Wednesdays, where we cover interesting things in history, politics, certain events, and that's the series is going to be titled That Time. And today's is That Time When America Was a One-Party State. Yes, that was a thing. So, in the wake of the American Revolution, pictured here is the Boston Tea Party, and most of these images came from Wikipedia and just Google searches. The United States had a fairly weak form of government under the Articles of Confederation, and that was eventually replaced with the Constitution that we now currently have. And despite Washington desiring no political parties to be formed ever, two quickly were formed, and they revolved around Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Alexander Hamilton, who, foreshadowing, was shot by Aaron Burr. Hamilton was very much the big government guy of early America. He wanted a very strong central government. He was also into the idea of a national bank and a stronger military, a standing military, which at the time was very controversial in American politics. However, he drew a lot of opposition, mainly against his cult of personality. He was one of the first to really have a party form around his personality rather than around a set of policy ideals. And that was led primarily by Thomas Jefferson, and this party became known as the Democratic Republicans. The Hamiltonians became known as the Federalists, because Hamilton was a prominent writer for the Federalist, which was a series of papers and pamphlets written by Hamilton, John Jay, who would later become a Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, and James Madison, who, hilariously, James Madison became a Democratic Republican. Democratic Republicans tended to be very agrarian, small government, let power go to the states and local governments rather than funnel it up to the national government, which is now known as the federal government. Well, during the War of 1812, which led to the election of 1816, the Federalist Party kind of became discredited as they had a more pro-British sentiment, which is probably a very bad thing to have when you're fighting a war against the British. And outside of New England, they essentially died out, and even in New England, by the time of 1820, they completely died out, even in New England. And if you go back to 1816, Monroe defeated the Federalist, I believe it was Angus King. Correct me if I'm wrong about the first name, but it was King was his last name. Monroe, he won convincingly. And in 1820, no one actually ran against him. The reason why John Quincy Adams received an electoral vote was contrary to the popular belief that that the elector decided Monroe should not win a unanimous victory because supposedly he wanted George Washington to be the only one who received a unanimous victory. It was actually just because he really, 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 really hated James Monroe. It had nothing to do with honoring George Washington, as the current myth states. Nowadays, if this were to happen, that would probably be the only reason not to award a unanimous victory. And as you can see, Virginia had West Virginia as part of it back in those days, and a few electors failed to show up specifically from Mississippi. So now we go on to, and notice that it's all Democratic-Republican. Well, technically there were no parties at this time, but they were all, well, there was only one party, and that was the Democratic-Republicans. And as you can see, in 1824, you have this awkward situation where 4 Democratic-Republicans run, because everyone was a Democratic-Republican. A lot of the Federalists moved in to become the Democratic-Republican Party, so we were a one-party state, but there was a lot of diversity under it. The Democratic-Republicans by this point were a big tent party, having former Federalists as well as the original Democratic-Republicans. So even though we were a one-party state, it didn't function that way because there was still a lot of debate, and a lot of that debate coalesced around the idea of North versus South. As you can see, the South tended to like the more agrarian Jacksonian ideals, as well as Crawford and, well, Clay was from states like that we would now call either the Rust Belt or the Southern Periphery: Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. He didn't win Indiana or Illinois because Jackson was extremely popular. And when I say he was extremely popular, a party literally formed around his persona. He is a cult of personality that created a party that has far outlived pro or anti-Jacksonian sentiment. And as you can see, John Quincy Adams, really his only support was in New England and the mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and of course New York. Jackson had support everywhere, but it was limited most in terms of his majorities. They were limited to the South and what we would now call the Midwest. There was a time when Illinois would actually vote in favor of, would vote alongside states like Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And if it wasn't for Crawford, Virginia and Georgia. However, this would break apart by 1824. So you could say from about 1818 to about 1824 was an era where we were a single-party state, a one-party state. And this era is known as the era of good feelings, where a lot of infrastructure improvements actually occurred. For example, the Erie Canal, and actually a lot of the canals that exist in the United States. The improvement of our coastal waterways, some work on what we would probably now just call paths, or trails, but at the time were roads. And there was also some unification between the states. If we go back, you can see Maine actually became a state in order to, permit Missouri becoming a state. And this was all mostly during the presidency of James Monroe, who was president from 1817 to 1825, when he didn't run for re-election and John Quincy Adams took over, in arguably one of the more corrupt moments in U.S. history. Then again, some of the stuff during the post-Reconstruction years could be argued to be even more corrupt, or even the Harding administration. But the election of 1824 broke the one-party system and ended the era of good feelings and brought about the antebellum years, the pre-Civil War years, where the divide between North and South grew, especially as northern states started abolishing slavery, and you started having a lot of Supreme Court decisions regarding slavery. And, of course, after 1824, Andrew Jackson is so furious, he forms his own political party to challenge John Quincy Adams and the people, and essentially challenge the government. It should be no surprise that Trump likes Jackson. To bring this into context and connect it to the modern era, it really shouldn't be a surprise that Trump likes Jackson, because Trump views himself in a similar light to Jackson, as somebody who the common people used to upset the establishment, who he feels has, cheated him out of power, but the people feel have cheated him out of power. And in some ways, at least on the Democratic side of the debate, minus policy, obviously, but Bernie Sanders could be seen as the Jackson of the modern Democratic Party. Again, ignoring policy. Because he is a way for the people, the normal people, to voice their frustrations with the party establishment and the party elite, who really have drifted far away from the ideals of the party. Jackson's party was a party of the people. He made it very clear. And when he was finally elected in 1828, he threw a massive party on the White House lawn, where people kind of went a little crazy, and they could only be stopped from going even crazier when they brought out giant tubs of whiskey to draw them away from the White House. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you all have a nice day. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day.